Strategies for Change Masterclass, The War on Disabled People with Ellen Clifford. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fiona, and I'm the coordinator of Strategies for Change. As part of our Strategies for Change program this year, we are running a series of masterclasses. In this month's masterclass, we have Ellen Clifford as a disabled activist who lives with mental distress and has worked within the disability sector for over 20 years. She is the author of The War on Disabled People, Capitalism, Welfare, and the Making of a Human Catastrophe, which won the 2021 Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing.
Thanks so much, Fiona. It's really lovely to be speaking to you all today. In the meeting with Fiona and also Damien ahead of this meeting, they were telling me about some of the things that's happening over in Ireland and deaf and disabled people starting to take control of your own organisations. And it sounds so exciting. I think I'd much rather hear from all of you than be speaking today. But here I am, and it's also massively flattering that you'd like to hear me talk. So as Fiona said, I'm a person who lives with mental distress, who has been involved in the disability sector for over 20 years. I think it's about 25 now. But that's mainly been within organisations run and controlled by deaf and disabled people. So we refer to them here as DDPOs. Also since 2010, I've been involved with a campaign group led by deaf and disabled people called Disabled People Against Cuts, known as DPAC. And DPAC was set up in 2010 from a protest that was held outside the Tory party conference. It was quite clear when the coalition government got elected that the Tories didn't get enough to actually have majority control, but they formed a coalition with the Lib Dems at the May 2010 general election. And from that point onwards, it was really clear that disabled people were in trouble. The then Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, said in his first budget in June 2010, he said, we're going to cut the disability living allowance budget by 20%. And of course, they used the excuse of all these apparent benefit cheats, and the right-wing media helped them really stoke that idea up. But actually, even by their own figures, there was only not more than 0.5% benefit fraud on the DLA caseload. So we knew that there were going to be some big cuts coming that would be affecting people and taking away essential everyday support. But unfortunately, a lot of our organisations had become de-radicalised over the previous years under the new Labour government and really weren't in a position to take up the fight. There was no overall England DDPO, or at least not one that had the kind of credibility of disabled people. And so DPAC kind of organically set up through the want of disabled people to actually start campaigning against this government. And so following that protest where disabled people came together to be involved in organising that protest, DPAC kind of grew out of that. And I was elected onto the first steering committee in 2011 and have been there ever since. But today I was thinking of maybe talking around my book in terms of, I guess, the main messages and the key aims I had with writing it. I should stress that I don't consider myself an author. I did enjoy it. I love researching. Writing's a bit more difficult, but I kind of only really did the book because, well, I definitely only did the book because a guy actually called, I don't know if you know Coronation Street over there. I don't watch it, but I know the name Ken Barlow is a big character in Coronation Street. And weirdly, this guy called Ken Barlow contacted me, and he was actually a commissioning editor with a left-wing book collective called Z Books. And he approached me and said, would you write a book for us? And I was like, yeah, that's kind of, I suppose, I've always wanted to write a book, but never thought I'd have the opportunity. And so that's how I did it. The publishers, sadly, actually, while I was writing the book, Z Books, which was, like I say, a great left-wing book collective, it actually got taken over by Bloomsbury, which is a massive publisher. And the handover was very difficult, and Ken actually left in protest. And so I was left with people who didn't know me. And I think all they wanted from the book was for me just to produce something that provided a very accessible overview of the different policy and legislative measures that had come in since 2010 and what their impact on disabled people had been. I had a bit my plan for the book was a bit more ambitious, but I didn't tell them because I didn't want to frighten them, that I was trying to do quite a lot of things. And I didn't even know if I'd managed to pull it all together myself. But what I really wanted to do was three key things. I think one was that I wanted to provide an account of that period of time and the events in it from the perspective of disabled people ourselves, people who'd been involved in it. And I wanted to make sure that disabled people's contributions were put on the historical record. I mean, I think as many of you will experience yourselves, very sadly, disabled people tend to die earlier than other people, and that's for a mixture of reasons. Discrimination within healthcare services, not least of those. And throughout the period since 2010, I've lost quite a number of friends and colleagues, some of them very close. And some of those deaths definitely happened earlier than they would have done without the cuts. And so I wanted to make sure that their contributions were acknowledged for future generations of disabled people. You may have heard of Mike Oliver, who's kind of considered the godfather of the social model, in that although, you know, the idea of the social model is based on ideas that were developed by disabled people together, he kind of coined the term, and it was his book, The Politics of Disablement, with Colin Barnes, that really kind of brought the social model to people's attention and made it a real thing. Mike said, shortly before he died in 2018, he said, he said in 2018, but he died in 2019. He said that we need to start writing our own history, otherwise people will write it for us and they'll leave us out of it. And I think that's definitely true. And I could already see that happening. So, for example, disabled campaigners, and Deepak put a lot of work into this, had sent a lot of evidence to the United Nations Disability Committee. And it took some persuasion over a couple of years, but convinced them to carry out an unprecedented investigation into the UK. And that investigation ended up making this finding that the UK government was guilty of grave and systematic violations of disabled people's rights due to welfare reform and austerity cuts. But I went through my work, ended up going to a couple of seminars where non-disabled academics had been invited, sadly on at least one occasion by an actual DDPO, had been invited to come and talk about the investigation, and they didn't say anything about the way that it had been triggered, and that it had been triggered by disabled campaigners and the effort that had gone into that, but also the vision that, you know, a couple of people in particular, Debbie Jolly, who co-founded Deepak and died before the findings of the investigation actually came out, quite tragically. And I think that they didn't know that bit of the history to it, but they also hadn't sort of bothered to find out that bit. And had it been disabled people who'd been involved in the investigation who'd been asked to speak instead, then, you know, more people would find out about that. But the assumption is always, you know, that people, you know, in positions such as academia know better than us. And so a lot of this ends up getting missed out. And I think it's really important to record evidence of how disabled people, how we do have agency, how we can make change happen ourselves, how we don't need non-disabled people to do things for us. And there is an agenda that wants us to be quiet about that. Because, for example, for charities who bring in their income and survive on the basis of promoting an image of disabled people as being in need, as objects of pity, so that people make donations. That's how they survive. They use those images so that people feel sorry for us and give them money. So, of course, that kind of more empowered image of disabled people is inconvenient for them. And they also don't want to lose their place round the table with people in positions of power, again, for the interest of their own organisations. So they do want to leave us out of things, and that's something that, as well as everything else, we have to struggle with, something that is a very real thing that we have to battle. So that was my first idea, and that didn't differ too much from what the publishers wanted. But I also, the second and third aims of mine were also more political, I suppose, in terms of the ideas that I wanted to put in there. And I think, although definitely Z Books would not have had any issue with the politics I wanted to express, I think possibly they would have been concerned that a first-time author was trying to do all this. But I didn't know I'd ever have another chance. So I wanted to try and do it all in one go. So the second thing I wanted to do was to try and get non-disabled people who are campaigners, and in particular from the perspective I was coming from, involved in like the anti-austerity and anti-capitalist movements. I wanted to get them interested in disability. I don't know if any of you have experienced this. It's been widespread frustration of disabled campaigners involved in those movements since 2010, but also through research for the book, I found out that this has been an issue for generations of disabled campaigners. The wider left doesn't see disability as a political issue, that it isn't of interest to anyone except disabled people ourselves. It's like non-disabled people, unless they've had cause to kind of question some of the dominant narratives around disability, unless they've got personal experience of it, they just kind of shut off when it comes to disability as, well, it's another issue. It's not really relevant to us. And they unquestionably take on board the narratives in society that present disabled people as, objects of pity, and present disability as a matter of personal tragedy, rather than the deeply political collective issue that we know that it is. And they don't see the way that disabled people are treated, and how that directly links to the wider economic and political agendas of the ruling class. And really, any serious anti-capitalist ought to be interested in disability politics. It's a marker of how cunning capitalism is, that there is this dominant idea in society that, of course, people with impairments are excluded and they're marginalized. But actually, that doesn't have to be the case. If we have different economic and social structures, then there are different possibilities. It's not inevitable that we should be left out. And of course, if you believe that it is inevitable, then, from that flows ideas that we should just be grateful for whatever support we get, and that, it's okay to cut our money, because really, we can't really hope for anything else. It's better targeting that money at other people. So I wanted to kind of interest people in what I think is absolutely fascinating political theory. But there was, of course, the barrier that if you're not interested in disability, why would you read the book anyway? So I had like quite a low benchmark for myself. I decided that success would be if 3 non-disabled campaigners read the book, and they have. For the award that Fiona mentioned, there were 4 people on the judging panel, and they definitely read it. But what was interesting was that they said, they've all been in kind of editing jobs or reviewing books for like the Times Literary Supplement and things. And they all said that the ideas in the book they'd never ever come across before. And you think these ideas are really basic to a lot of disabled people, ideas like the social model of disability, but they'd never ever had the opportunity to find out those ideas because they're just not within the spheres where they operate. And I guess partly because of all of the disabling barriers that disabled people face, we don't often get the chance to write books apart from anything else. So I feel that I was able to make a small dent, but still I think the situation is that within, for example, larger political conferences, the workshops on disability are still sadly only attended usually by disabled people. So we still have, there's still a big job to go on that. And then the third aim really was that I wanted to put the events that happened from 2010 onwards within their wider political and economic context and how they fit in with the intrinsic relationship between disability and capitalism. Once things started happening in 2010, these cuts, these changes to the benefit system, a lot of people were just shocked. They were paralyzed by shock, I would say. The majority of disabled people don't identify as disabled people, or certainly aren't politically active as disabled people. And that means that they often have taken on board the kind of dominant ideas in society. And not only is there one that, we are objects of pity, but there's also this idea that governments repeat and repeat and repeat, which is society will always protect the most vulnerable, as they call us. And because people believed that, once they found all their money being stopped and that they were being left with nothing to live on because of the lies of assessors pushing them off disability benefits, people could not believe that this could be happening in the 6th richest country in the world. People really didn't understand it. It did mean that a lot more people got involved in campaigning. We had huge new layers of disabled activists, more people identifying as disabled, lots of new campaigners, which is great for the campaigning movement. But a lot of people kind of focused their anger, understandably so, on the people who were in power, and deservedly so, because those people were consciously making decisions that would have such a widespread detrimental impact on people's lives. At the most extreme end, people taking their own lives, leaving suicide notes saying, I've got no way to carry on, which they dismiss that because, of course, suicide is a complex issue. That's the government's line on it. People starving to death in such a rich country. So we should never let off the hook the people making those decisions. But it is a much bigger picture than just having some nasty people at the top of government. And if your idea is just that it's a couple of nasty people at top of government, then what you think is that there are other people involved who will listen. So it ended up with a situation where just reams and reams and reams of evidence was being collected to show the impacts of what was happening. And there was a widespread idea, I think, that if we just show all this evidence of the impacts to people in power, including backbench MPs, then then something will happen. They will make change happen. They will stop this from happening. And of course that didn't happen, and that led to even more shock and disbelief and paralysis among people. There was also the issue that I think some of the new campaigners didn't know the history of what had happened before, and I think it was very important to explain the years up until 2010, and how, in fact, although it was the Conservative-led government that introduced things like the work capability assessment that was having such a devastating impact, particularly on people with invisible impairments, that assessment had been in development for decades, actually. New Labour had tried to bring it in and to bring in ideas around the need to have a lot fewer people on out of work benefits. Back in the late 1990s, they hadn't got away with it, and Direct Action Network, who were then active at the time, actually threw red paint at Downing Street, and the kind of outcry around that meant that the government realised they couldn't get away with the cuts, and so they went back and they spent a lot of time actually preparing the ground to be able to do it later. It just so happened that it was the Tories that did it later. But the way that they prepared the ground was to start to drip a narrative that the social security system was overrun with benefit fraud, and creating in the public mind a link between disabled people and benefit cheats. So although the hostility wasn't targeted at disabled people ourselves, the way that it has manifested in terms of hostility has been a public perception that many disabled people, particularly those with invisible impairments, are fakers. So when the then Tory government tried to bring in all these changes and these cuts, there wasn't an outcry from the public. People thought it was necessary. A piece of research by DDPO, I used to work for Inclusion London, together with the University of Glasgow, I think it was, found that some members of the public thought that benefit fraud was as much as 70% of the disability benefit caseload, when, like I said, it was only 0.5%. So there was a really good job done on the spin and the narratives there. But what had been happening, while New Labour was preparing the ground, was that they were actually speaking to disabled people's faces. They were sounding very progressive. They brought out the Improving Life Chances report in 2005, which promised full disability equality by 2025. And I remember disabled people at the time, we were up in arms because 2025 was so far away. When actually we look at what we've got now, and we could have waited a bit if it didn't mean everything, everything transpiring as it did. There was a lot of hope at that time, I think, that things really were moving in a very positive direction and we were going to see real change. And I think that there are lessons for DDPOs and for campaigners from that period of time about the dangers of sitting around the table and getting too cozy with government. There are dangers of co-option, definitely. There are a lot of leaders of the disabled people's movement who ended up going and working for government, taking positions, and who can blame them? But what happened is that the campaigning movement became really, really de-radicalized. And then when a government came in as committed to an ideological agenda that was to the severe detriment of disabled people, as the Tories were, then came in, we weren't equipped to be able to provide the resistance that was really needed. Where we were able to make a difference was through legal challenges and through outsider campaigning. We haven't, since 2010, the kind of campaign groups that emerged, we haven't been able to change the direction of travel. Things have carried on, getting worse and worse and worse, but we have managed to hold them back. And and that was largely through legal challenges and outsider campaigning, which is why they're now trying to take those away. The new Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act is making it illegal to peacefully protest. So we're doing, DPAC has just got some funding actually to do some work with other civil and political rights groups to kind of look exactly at what that means, what the new powers of surveillance mean, exactly what the law is regarding protests, because we don't want to put our members in situations where they're going out and they're more likely to be arrested than they were before without knowing that. So we want to make sure everyone's briefed on that. The government is also bringing in a review of judicial review that will make it much more difficult for people to take legal challenges against the government. And it's not as if it's not difficult enough at the moment. You have to find a person who's personally affected by whatever change they are proposing to bring in, and you have to bring the legal challenge within 3 months of the decision being made. And it is very frightening for disabled people to be taking the government to the High Court. A lot of people worry about retribution, about the impact that it might have. Also because people on out of work, in order to be able to take a legal challenge, you need to be eligible for legal aid, because there's no way you can afford it otherwise. If you are eligible for legal aid, it means you're on out of work benefits, and people are worried that the benefits assessors will see that you've been involved in a legal challenge and say that you're therefore fit for work, because they will use any excuse to find you fit for work. So it's actually already very difficult to take legal challenges. Already a vast amount of policy and legislative measures get passed that are actually illegal in terms of them actually actively discriminating against disabled people. But because there's no route to challenge them, they become law. The Office for Budgetary Responsibility does hold campaigners responsible, though, for the fact that the savings that George Osborne set out to make in June 2010 have never been achieved. Not only that, the government is now spending more on the benefit it replaced DLA with, personal independence payment. I would say that actually it's more likely to be down to the fact that cost of living is going up. So a higher number of people who are disabled are actually applying for the benefit because they didn't need it before, but they do now. But according to the OBR, it's because campaigners have been sharing information on social media how to get around the assessments, and we've taken legal challenges. So we've got some really serious challenges ahead, some big threats to disabled people's rights and to our standards of living coming up. It's still a very frightening period, and people are really worn down, not least through COVID, when people felt that society was saying that our lives are dispensable. We've had deaths, we've had many key activists that we've lost. At the same time, it's difficult to get younger people involved. There is a crisis in younger people's mental health here at the moment, and that obviously affects disabled people just as much or perhaps more. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges, and I suppose that's why I think that it's more important than ever that we have an analysis of what's happening and why, and a strategy for resisting it. I think it's important that we acknowledge the things that we have been able to do, because otherwise it would just feel like we would feel like giving up. I think that disabled people have managed a huge amount over here since 2010, despite having so much increasingly stacked against us. And so I think it's really important to have that kind of sense of disability pride in terms of, how resourceful we actually can be. And also there is something really beautiful, I think, about the way that we show each other support and solidarity, and that we operate collectively. Within DPAC, what I value so much is the way well, the way that we're all, the way that we feel valued. We kind of organise on an ethos whereby everyone's contribution is valued for whatever they can do. There isn't an expectation on anyone to do anything. People just contribute as they can and however they can, and that makes it a really kind of, what's the word? No, I lost the words, because it just makes you feel that you're accepted for who you are rather than judged, as we so often feel within the wider non-disabled environment. And that brings out the best in people. It really does. It gives people the ability to do things like, I speak to groups of people now, whereas before Deepak I could never ever do that. People are able to grow, and I hate the phrase because it was used by the government for a strategy paper a few years ago, but kind of fulfill our potential. I think the capitalist society wastes people's potential, particularly disabled people. And I think it's nice to actually exist, albeit within a very limited environment, within a wider hostile environment, just to be able to exist for a while in a place where you feel able to do the best you can and to be valued for that. And I think that does give me hope that we can create an alternative within society, and that cooperation and collective organisation holds the potential for us to do so much more. And I do want to explore it, and that makes me, want to go on. I think also the peer support that disabled people have shown each other through not just the cuts, austerity and welfare reform, but also through COVID. That was such a valuable thing. And those frameworks for support and solidarity were in place, of course, because we were having to, resist the cuts. So that helped a lot of people through COVID. And even if we exist in our campaigning just to help each other get through benefit and social care assessments, well, that's enough on its own. But to have also been able to hold the government back, for them to be as frightened of us as they are, that makes me feel that we've achieved something. So I think, to finish, the real key message that I wanted to get across in the book, I suppose, is that the exclusion of disabled people, disability discrimination, they're absolutely not inevitable. They are linked to the social and economic structures we live under. I think that disability as an issue really powerfully exposes the true nature of capitalism and the way that people's talents and people's lives are so casually wasted under it. I think that so long as we live under a system that puts profit before people, disabled people are going to always have to struggle for the resources that we need to survive. In times of economic prosperity, we'll get concessions. But what we can't let happen, as we did over here during the New Labour years, is become complacent about that. We have to remember that as soon as there's economic recession, those things will be taken away from us. That our existence is very fragile in this system that we live under. But to also remember that change is possible when we come together, and to always fight to maintain those structures of solidarity that exist between us, but to also, I think the task is to enlarge those, to include other people who also want to fight for social justice and fairness. Thank you.